Hello everybody, and welcome to the Akokisa Native Village here at Jesse Jones Park and Nature Center. My name is Jason Naivar, and one of my jobs is I get to maintain our village here at the park. Now, the Akokisa, who once lived in this area, were nomadic hunters and gatherers. These people lived a very, very hardy and rough life. And one of the really cool things about them is that despite all of these challenges, they lived in balance with nature. The Akokisa were a subgroup of the Atakapaw-speaking natives of southeast Texas and southwestern Louisiana. The structures we're going to talk about today, you're going to notice, are very simple, but they were strong and they were light so that they could be moved from one location to the other. To my left is what we call the lean-to. The lean-to was the storage area where the Akokisa, once items were made or food was prepared, where it would be stored. So this was kind of like the warehouse for the natives. This is where they kept everything. And this is where the women and children would come to get food throughout the day. The next two stops on our tour are the brush arbor and the chief's hut. The brush arbor was where the women of the village would come to work every day. While the men are out hunting, or unfortunately sometimes at war, the women would stay close to the village and they would gather all the materials for the day, whether it's preparing food or preparing the different types of crafts like basket weaving, pottery, also the tanning of hides. That would all be done in the brush arbor. Basically, it's just a shaded open air space that would allow nice cool breeze to come through while the women worked. On my left, we have the chief's hut. This is usually going to be a little bit larger than the other wickiup structures in the village, and it's usually going to be centralized. Sometimes along the coast, the chief's hut would be built upon shell middens, which are basically discarded oyster shells, and this would kind of elevate the structure and make it a little more grand. So if you were to think, the chief's hut would be kind of like the mayor's mansion, and your brush arbor would be where everyone would go to work every single day. Next on our tour is the council lodge. This was the social backbone of the Akokisa village. This is where everyone would come together, either to meet with the chief and the elders, or where the kids would come to listen to stories from the elders. The Akokisa didn't have pen or paper. Everything had to be passed down from one person to another. And it was usually done from an elder to a child, and then so on and so forth. And this is how stories, knowledge, information was passed down over several generations. They would sit around the fire in the shade of the council lodge and learn about the ancient legends of their peoples. They also would come and meet with the chief if they had any grievances. So this was where everybody came together, but it was also kind of like a courthouse where everyone would sit down and problems would be worked out in the village. Now, most of the time, there were two separate chiefs. You would have your village chief, but then if the Akokisa were having a problem with a neighbor nearby, they might go to war. The eldest chief, he would then designate a war chief, who would then leave the site and would go deal with whatever situation arose. But once that war chief came back, he was now under the authority of the village chief. The next subject I want to discuss is food. The Akokisa didn't have supermarkets. They didn't have refrigerators. Everything that they ate, they had to find or hunt on their own. Now, being here in Southeast Texas, they had a lot of options. And foraging around the village was a very important job for the women of the village. Now, the children, they did not forage. And most of the time, they would nurse even up to the age of 10, because foraging out in the woods is very, very taxing when it comes to calories. So the mother, she would go out and she would look for different items like black walnuts, acorns, hickory nuts, She would also look for berries. These are American beauty berries, and they are a native species to this area. Although they're very small and they don't taste very well, you know what? They'll still do in a pinch. Other things they would have eaten were dewberries, blackberries. They could dig up the tubers of the greenbrier plant, which was very dense in starches, very high in calories. And what they would do is they would grind this down and make a very fine powder for which they could make a type of bread or even use to thicken soups. Once the technology was around to create pottery, they of course would take advantage of this. And this would help them to store their food longer. But the Akokisa did not farm. So they had to find everything. Now, also, they would hunt. They would hunt small mammals like squirrels, rabbits, even things like raccoons and possums. They were very opportunistic in their food choices. But then they would also go for larger game like bison, deer, and black bear. And after hunting these animals, the Akokisa were very good at tanning the hides and then trading those hides to get other items from either the European colonists or from other tribes. Our next structure is the sweat lodge. This was one of the most important structures in the entire village because it housed the medicine man. So you could think of the medicine man as a partial doctor and a partial spiritual advisor, because the Akokisa and a lot of Native Americans believed that medical conditions and spirituality were one and the same. So if you had one of those problems, this is where you would come. Now, the medicine man would perform ceremonies of all types, most notably the sweat lodge, in which this small structure would be covered with animal hides or very thick palmettos. And inside would be a pouch of water. Outside would be a small fire where rocks would be placed into this fire where they would then heat up. Once the rocks were hot enough, they would be placed inside of that pouch, which would boil the water and create the steam. They would stay inside and sweat would then come out of their pores. And in something leaving their body, they believed that they were being spiritually cleansed. The medicine man would create salves, poultices, and different types of ceremonial drinks from what he found around the village. One of these, which was super important to the Native Americans, was the yaupon shrub. The yaupon shrub is the only natural source of caffeine in America. So they would, of course, drink this in the morning. They would drink a tea in the morning. It's very stimulating. But then, during special ceremonies, they would take these leaves and they would make a very concentrated tea called black drink. Now, the tea itself is not an emetic. It will not make you sick. So what the natives would do is they would add either semi-toxic herbs or even, potentially, the berries from the yaupon tree itself. And adding this to the tea, the natives would then vomit. This would make them sick. And in having this huge amount of material leaving their body, this was like a massive spiritual cleansing to them. And it was a very important ritual. Now, the Akokisa didn't always live in inland villages like this. They were nomadic, remember? So they moved around where the food was here in the inland areas during the fall and the winter months. But during the spring and the summer, they migrated down to the coast where food was more plentiful. Now you might think, how did they make their way all the way down to the coast with everything that they owned? Well, the Akokisa were masters at carving dugout canoes, usually made from the wood of the cypress tree, which is very, very resistant to rot and water. These canoes would be anywhere from 10 to even sometimes 20 feet long because they had to keep all their possessions in those canoes. Once they reached their location down along the coast, they did not live in wickiups like you see here that we talked about earlier. They lived in something called the chiki. Now the chiki looks like this structure just behind me here, except it was sometimes 20 feet off the ground. Now a lot of people think this is because it would keep animals at bay and it would also keep you out of the tides. But more importantly, it would get you out of the mosquito zone. Most mosquitoes, they like to hang around the ground where most of their prey lives, like us. The Akokisa found out that if they lived in an elevated structure along the coast, this would minimize the mosquitoes. They would also build smudge fires beneath these structures. The smoke would also keep those mosquitoes away. And as a third line of defense, they would rub rancid alligator fat all over themselves because they found out that there was something about that specific compound that kept the mosquitoes away. So this was like their own native bug repellent. So the Akokisa, despite having all of these challenges, lived and flourished in Southeast Texas for centuries. So every time you think about, oh, my car broke down, or you think, oh my gosh, my refrigerator's not working, remember, there were people that lived hundreds of years ago living off the land and without any of our modern conveniences. Thank you for taking the tour with us today, and have a wonderful day.